So this is my Geist of St. Traft Standard-legel EDH deck. And I think like a lot of Commander players, once I got into the format of Commander, I had a really hard time enjoying Standard anymore. Because, you know, once you play an Eternal format where you get to play with all sorts of different cards and you get to be really creative, it's hard to get back into Standard where there's a whole lot of net decking, lack of creativity, you see a lot of the same cards, and then, you know, everything rotates once a year. So I got really sick of that and basically transitioned permanently into Commander for my constructed decks. But, you know, I still wanted to play in the FNMs, right? Because, you know, that's where all the trading is, that's where all the action is. So I sort of came up with this compromise where I would build a standard-legel EDH deck. And, you know, the main reason I play EDH is to explore different cards that I normally don't get to play with. And I found that, you know, one of the solutions to this boring standard format is to restrict myself to one-ofs, 100-card deck, so I could explore all these cards in the new sets that, you know, you normally don't get to play with, because they're bad in EDH, they're bad in Standard, and, you know, maybe they're not even easy to pick up in Limited, so you never get to play with some of these cards. So this is a way I kept the game interesting for myself at FNMs, because I still wanted to compete there and without driving myself crazy. So I guess it goes without saying that I play at a pretty casual store, because I actually do win quite a few games with this. I have actually won an FNM with EDH deck in the past. I believe that was a Gideon deck. I've been doing this for a while. I played a Rexiel Standard EDH, Glissa, Gideon. So I guess this is my fourth one. I'm looking forward to hopefully a red-green Werewolf Legend, so I could build around that, get an aggro deck going. But anyways, enough about that. This is a standard deck, which is designed around a mid-game strategy. So due to the fact that I have to spread myself pretty thin, it's hard to be pretty consistent. So the goal of this deck is just to survive the early game, you know, the onslaught that is early game Standard, and play a whole bunch of late game bombs, because there's a whole bunch of nasty 6-drops in this format, like the Titans and Mr. Wurmcoil Engine up there. So basically this deck is meant to be slower than the aggro decks, but still a little more aggressive than the control decks out there. So I'll show you this deck, and hopefully, you know, you might get into Standard EDH, because it really is a lot more fun than the traditional 60-card Standard format. So as always, I will start by talking about the Commander, and there's really not a whole lot to say, because, you know, technically I'm not allowed to cast this guy during Standard games. That's like one of the rules they have. So basically, he just sort of sits on the sidelines as a sort of cheerleader. And you might think, you know, what's the point of that? Does that really help? Yes, yeah, it helps a lot, actually, if your opponent knows what they're up against. You know, when they're getting beaten down by a, you know, massive 100-card deck, and then they see this guy there staring them down, it really gives you an edge. So, you know, I recommend having your general on the sidelines. You might think, well, why don't you shuffle him into the deck and, you know, give yourself a shot at drawing him. Well, I do that as well, so I have a second copy, one in the main deck. And so I am running a 100-card deck, not a 99-card deck. And, yeah. This guy is also my Angel token. But yeah, basically this guy is going to restrict us to white and blue, which means we're going to have access to counterspells, wraths, big fat creatures, decent removal, card draw, basically everything that's going to give us a chance. So, yeah, this guy's pretty cool. So I'll start with the creatures. And for a deck that claims to be kind of a control deck, there really are a lot of creatures. I guess the reason for that is that this is not an Eternal format, so all of those power creeped creatures, I have access to all of those. As you can see, the mana curve sort of bumps at 2. These are mostly utility creatures and mana dorks. And then some random utility, some aggressive creatures. Basically, the key to this deck is just surviving to 6 mana, because we have access to a bunch of really disgusting 6 and 7 drops. So basically, creatures in here need to help me survive to get to turn 6, or else, you know, put some pressure on a control player early on. So stuff like Hero of Bladehold, Geist of St. Traft, they can actually put on early pressure, and I can play the aggro deck. But basically, I'm just looking to survive into the late game, where I actually have a pretty decent shot. So like any good commander deck, we need to have lots of mana ramp. Yeah, there's no Soul Ring or like Mana Crypt in this format, so we have some pretty subpar mana dorks here, and they're all creatures. Silver Myr, Gold Myr, pretty standard, help my color fixing. Deranged Assistant, another 2-drop that taps for 1. He's going to mill me, which might help a little. I've got like Moorland Haunt and Buried Ruin and stuff. Plague Myr, just another 2-drop that taps for 1. He also has Infect, which is pretty nifty. I have actually won a game on turn 5 thanks to Angelic Destiny and this guy. So he is a threat to win a game sometimes. Palladium Myr is actually pretty disgusting. Like I said, this deck just really wants to get to turn 6 to start pumping out threats. And Palladium Myr lets me get to my turn 6 on turn 4. So this guy really should be kill on sight to my opponent because he's going to put me way ahead. And then Solemn Simulacrum, one of those commander staples that's actually standard legal. So he goes right in. So something this deck really struggles with is keeping up with the speed of the standard format. You've only got 20 life, and there's stuff like Signal Pest and, I don't know, whatever those human decks are running these days. Anyways, really fast decks, and they're really freaking annoying. So you just need to sort of survive those first few turns, and so you need to have some cards that will give you some early board presence and hopefully some blockers. So Gideon's Lawkeeper, a 1-drop who will stem some of that aggro damage. Cathedral Membrane, pretty cool 2-drop, possibly 1-drop. So you get a 0/3, and he actually trades with almost anything that he blocks. So he's a pretty good board presence. He actually can kill Titans, but you know, if your opponent's swinging with a Titan, you've probably already lost, so that's not really that big of a deal. But he's just going to help stem the early game aggro from basically any card that's supposed to help you against aggro decks should pass the Hero of Bladehold / Myr and Crusader test, which means it needs to be able to trade with those 2 cards. And yeah, where I play, those human decks sort of run rampant, so I really like Cathedral Membrane. And then Spellskite, he's sort of anti-aggro because they tend to run a lot of cheap spot removal, and he's a 0/4 for 2, which means he's actually going to be a pretty decent early game blocker. Next we have some cheap utility creatures. These 2 guys here help me draw cards. Treasure Mage, decent creature for 2 mana, you get a 2/1. 4 mana to draw a card, that's kind of a really slow deal, but you know, at least you've got a decent attacker on the board early on. It's at least going to trade with any of your opponent's creatures. Mentor of the Meek, I do have all those mana dorks and a whole bunch of small creatures, so I can actually get some decent value out of this, along with a whole bunch of cards that do a pretty good job of comboing with this, so like Mimic Vat, White Sun Zenith, Hero of Bladehold, a whole bunch of ways to pump out tokens and draw a bunch of cards off this guy, so I really like him. Snapcaster Mage, don't need to say a whole lot about him, he's actually pretty fantastic. Treasure Mage, yeah, you might think, well, you know, isn't Trinket Mage standard legal? Yeah, Trinket Mage really doesn't get a whole lot in this format. Treasure Mage, however, can get Wurmcoil Engine, and Wurmcoil Engine is probably the nastiest creature this deck could ask for, because I really need that life gain against those aggressive decks. So Treasure Mage just gives me double the odds of drawing Wurmcoil Engine. And I've also got a Steel Hellkite as my plan B. And then Phantasmal Image and Phyrexian Metamorph. Clones are always good because it means I will always at least have a creature that's as good as my opponent's best creature. So cloning Titans is always really good. Phantasmal Image is awesome against Thrun the Last Troll because you don't target him to copy him. So that's one really good way to kill him. And yeah, these 2 are just really efficient clones. So now on to some more aggressive creatures. Like I said before, this deck does aim to be fairly aggressive. However, it's not necessarily fast, so most of these are relatively high on the curve. Starting with Geist of St. Traft. So for 3 mana we get 6 power, part hexproof, part flying. So this thing's really hard to deal with, and yeah, it's one of the nastiest things you can get out on turn 3 to pressure a control deck. Hero of Bladehold, another really efficient creature. You get 7 power for 4 mana, and it's just going to get worse if your opponent doesn't deal with it. And one of the reasons I added this was just because I got so sick of playing against it. You know, it's so hard to deal with if you don't have a Wrath effect, and it just does so much damage so fast. Precursor Golem, another really efficient creature. You get 9 power for 5 mana. Obviously, it's really bad against red removal or, you know, whatever other people have that can kill Precursor Golem. I guess my favorite thing about this is that I can bring it back with Buried Ruin and, you know, keep producing more golems. Obviously, if you have a choice, you want to chump block with the Precursor Golem rather than the tokens, because the card is the one that has the drawback, not the tokens. Archon of Justice, not a super efficient aggressive creature, but it does tend to control the board when it's out. So for 5 mana, you get a 4/4 flyer, which is solid, and your opponent really doesn't want to attack into this, because you're going to get rid of his Titan or whatever. So 6 mana is the magic number for this deck, because that's when you can start spitting out disgusting efficient creatures. And most of these creatures are actually playable in Commander, so you know that the creatures in Standard are quite high quality. So Steel Hellkite, we get a 5 power fire-breathing dragon that can destroy stuff when it hits your opponent. This is basically my backup plan for Treasure Mage, but it's pretty good all on its own. Sun Titan and Frost Titan, these seem like pretty obvious choices. Sun Titan is annoying because he's hard to kill, and he can deal with opponents' threats pretty consistently. Sun Titan has plenty of things that can recur, such as small creatures and pacifism effects, which I have quite a few of. Wurmcoil Engine is probably the best creature in this deck because it gives control decks headaches because it's so hard to kill. It gives aggro decks headaches because it's so hard to kill, and because it has lifelink. And the lifelink is the really crucial part because you've only got 20 life, and it's hard to stay alive against those super fast decks. So usually you want to get Wurmcoil Engine out if you can, as soon as possible. And hey, Consecrated Sphinx, he's legal and standard. How about that? And Sunblast Angel, this is actually a pretty crucial card in this deck because you're so short on wrath effects, and like I said, those super fast aggressive decks are the main nemesis. So this is going to blow away your opponent who just alpha striked, and you're going to get a 4/5 flyer for your troubles. I've had this under Mimic Rat before, it's pretty sick. And on to the 7 drops to round out the creatures. Sphinx of Uthun is a pretty fat body, 5/6 flyer, and you get a Factor Fiction when it comes into play. So that's pretty good. Phyrexian and Jester, we don't have Duplicant in Standard, but this guy is pretty good as well. He's actually one of the nicest responses to Wurmcoil Engine, which is something I've done before. My opponent was not pleased. Elish Norn, yeah, like I said, we need more answers to those super fast aggressive decks, so she's going to come out and blast away all those tokens and pump away your team while she's at it. So she's actually a pretty solid 7-drop. Okay, so moving into the non-creatures, every good blue deck needs counterspells. And, we're dealing with some pretty crappy ones here, but, what are you going to do? Some obvious ones, Cancel, Stoic Rebuttal, Mana Leak, Dissipate is pretty good in Standard these days. Negate. Mental Misstep, this isn't something you get to see in EDH very often, but it's pretty fantastic in Standard. So this is one of my favorite cards to stop those stupid 1-drop humans, and stuff like Ponder. So I really like Mental Misstep. Then Lost in the Mist. This thing is so bad, but I think I'm running this because I'm in like Cryptic Command Withdrawal or something, because this is the first time I've played a blue deck without being allowed to run Cryptic. So you get half of Cryptic Command for more mana. I guess that's fair. Okay, so spot removal. We don't have Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares, so we're going to use a lot of pacifism effects. So Pacifism, Oblivion Ring, Arrest, Force Worship, these are all going to take out single targets. Force Worship is pretty cool because you can return it to your hand to make sure you've always got it on the best creature on the field. I once comboed this off with a Venser emblem back when I had Venser in this deck. So I was, bouncing it and playing it over and over again to exile my opponent's stuff. Mind Control and Volition Reigns. I really like these ones because, there's Titans in this format. This is a 2-card swing, basically, because you're taking their best creature and putting it on your side of the field to block their second best creature. So these will work pretty well. Revoke Existence. I'm running this one main deck because there's a whole lot of Oblivion Rings where I play, a lot of Swords of Feast and Famine and stuff, and Honor of the Pure, and a whole bunch of annoying little enchantments like that. So I decided to run one of these main deck so I could deal with those pre-sideboard. Some more creature removal. Standard is sorely lacking in wrath effects, but we do have the classic Day of Judgment. Phyrexian Rebirth, which is pretty devastating against those stupid human decks, because you get a big fat token for your trouble. And Ratchet Bomb, also good against tokens, but this will also take out annoying stuff like Birthing Pod and Oblivion Ring if you need it to. So, pretty good. I also wish I had an Elspeth's Hero. I haven't been able to pick one of those up, but she would be another sort of wrath effect, because you can build up to her ability that destroys all other creatures. Card draw. Every good commander deck needs to be able to draw cards. So, I have my 1 of Ponder. I always feel like such a boss when I have this in my opening hand, because it's such an awesome card to have on your turn 1. Not a whole lot to say about this. It's a really good card. Divination, Yeehaw, Think Twice, Tezzeret's Gambit, I've proliferated with this before. Jace, pretty solid card draw. Not so good against the aggro decks because he costs 5 mana and he's easy to get blown away. But he's also a win condition, obviously. Mind Culling, one of my favorite stupid gems in this deck, because whenever I play it, my opponent has to read it, because no one's heard of this card. So for 6 mana, you draw 2, your opponent discards 2. That's a pretty massive swing. I really love mind culling. Next we've got some token makers. Timely Reinforcements is obviously a crucial card in the Standard. This is one of those cards I really wish I could run more than one of, because this is so helpful when I draw it. So life gain and creature tokens will really help against those aggressive decks. And White Sun Zenith. This is actually a pretty slow card, but as an instant, this card is pretty devastating. So I can flash this in at end of turn against those control decks. So, you know, they lost their chance to wrath away my board because they came in end of turn. And these cats are kind of slow against aggressive decks because, you know, 3 and X means I need to survive to like turn 7 to get a decent value out of this. And by then, you know, 2/2s aren't that impressive. So this is mostly good against control decks. It's a pretty effective card against wraths. I am running a ton of creatures, and not all of them are super threatening, so I've got these handy pump spells. Angelic Destiny, one of those few auras that's actually worth it, because it keeps coming back even if they nuke the creature. And this is going to turn your creature into probably the biggest creature on the board. So this is obviously very good with Geist of St. Traft and Plague Myr. Either of those creatures will win on turn 5 with Angelic Destiny. But really, if you get this on any creature, you're probably in a winning position. And then Sword of Feast and Famine. So this is pretty good. Blue decks always like to untap their lands, especially in Standard when you don't have a whole lot of mana exile. So Sword of Feast and Famine is pretty solid. And rounding out the last of the non-creatures, we have Gideon Jura. He's obviously very good against those creature decks, because he's going to Fog, up to 8 loyalty, which is pretty handy, and he can also destroy tapped creatures, and of course he's also a win condition because he can swing. So Gideon Jura is good against almost any deck. And Mimic Vat. Probably one of my favorite cards in the deck, one of my favorite cards that's currently in Standard, I think. So this will give control decks fits because it's going to keep bringing back threats that they can't keep nuking away because you're just going to make more. And it's good against aggressive decks because you're going to keep generating blockers. Mimic Vat is just a lot of fun. So cards I've had under Mimic Vat include Wurmcoil Engine, Snapcaster Mage, Sunblast Angel, Frost Titan, Sun Titan. You know, basically every good card in this deck I've placed under a Mimic Vat at one point in time. And generally it creates pretty hilarious results. So I highly recommend Mimic Vat in any of your Standard decks, whether they're Commander legal or not. So now onto the mana base. I'm running a whopping 43 lands in this deck, which seems quite high for a Commander deck, but you have to consider the fact that I don't have Sol Ring, I don't have Enlightened Tutor to go find Sol Ring, and most importantly, this isn't multiplayer, right? Like in Commander, if you miss a few land drops, people are just gonna, you know, ignore you and go after the people who are actually building up a board. In Standard, you have one opponent, and he's going to go after you no matter how screwed you are for mana. So you really can't play games with missing land drops. So 43 seems like a pretty good number, along with all my stupid 2-drop mana dorks like Myrs. So the utility lands, we have Moorland Haunt here. Obviously an excellent card. It's destroying Standard right now, so, you know, it's going to be pretty good in my deck. Why not? Ghost Quarter to kill other people's Moorland Haunts, and, you know, Kessig Wolfrun and Inkmoth Nexuses. Buried Ruin is actually quite fantastic in this deck. I have Precursor Golem and Wurmcoil Engine and Sword of Feast and Famine. So this thing's actually going to be quite a pain in the late game. Inkmoth Nexus, because, like, why not? I guess it can go all the way with Plague Myr. And some dual lands, Seachrome Coast and Glacial Fortress, and a whole bunch of basics. But wait, there's more. Yes, I have a sideboard. At first, it seems stupid to bother with a sideboard for such a, obviously, casual deck, but it's actually pretty crucial. You really need to have this edge to give yourself a chance against those super fast aggressive decks or those dedicated control decks. Plus, it gives you a chance to play with more hilarious cards. So like you saw in the main deck, I do have some creatures that are dedicated to slowing down aggro decks, and I've got a few more of these in the sideboard. Blinding Soul Eater is yet another tapper on a pretty defensive body. These guys are also really good against those stupid illusions because they can just, you know, kill them. Fiend Hunter comes into play and exiles a creature, so this is going to give me a much better board position. It gives me a 1/3 blocker as well as dealing with a threat. Mirran Crusader. I mostly just bring this in to give me some decent board presence against the really fast decks. It was originally main deck, but I found I didn't really need this guy as an aggressive card. Choking Fumes and Marrow Shards. Like I said, there's a lot of super fast human decks in my meta, so this gives me a chance against those. These are also really good against Inkmoth Nexus and yeah, humans. So I really like Choking Fumes and Marrow Shards. Marrow Shards is pretty hilarious because you can cast this for free and catch people off guard. Divine Reckoning. You might think this would deserve a main deck spot, which is where it was originally, but it really is quite terrible. It's only really good against the super swarmy decks, so you don't really want this main deck because you're not going to have fun with it, trust me. Two cards I generically side in against control decks, just because I want to board out all of those anti-aggro cards that I have in the main deck and bring in some more control aspects. So Fuel for the Cause, just another counter spell. Mind Unbound. This one's pretty cool just because it's basically a win condition that I have on an enchantment, and a lot of control decks don't have many anti-enchantment cards, so this one could potentially go all the way. Turn Aside and Redirect. These are for those heavy spot removal decks. Those decks that like to have 4 of every spot removal card in the format. So I like to bring those in for a nasty surprise. Celestial Purge and Flash Freeze, just sort of anti-specific colors, so those are pretty efficient when they're good. Phyrexian Evoker, good against Planeswalkers, good against sort of Feast and Famine. Both of those kinds of cards can really give me trouble. Master Thief. I guess I lied. This is the best answer to Wurmcoil Engine. And this is just one of those most hilarious cards in the format that you probably don't get a chance to play in any other deck. So I really like Master Thief. I like stealing Swords of War and Peace and stuff. And then Divine Offering. Just one more answer to Swords and Wurmcoil Engines and pesky artifacts like that. So that's my sideboard. It's a lot of fun. Alright, so that's the deck, and it really is just going to play out as sort of a hybrid standard EDH deck would, You're going to focus on mana early game, which is sort of an EDH thing you don't see a whole lot of in standard, but Palladium Myr really is crucial to making this deck go off very quickly. Then you really need to make sure that you have some way to deal with those hyper-fast aggro decks, because you only have 20 life, it's 1v1, not multiplayer, so you can expect to be facing a lot of damage early on. So you can't relegate your anti-aggressive cards to your sideboard, you need to have a lot of answers main deck. So you get to play with some fun utility creatures, and then it's going to play like a traditional control deck, so counter spells, spot removal, card draw, sweepers are crucial, and basically you're going to win the game just by building towards your crazy dangerous end game, so your nasty 6-drops, your highly efficient aggressive creatures, and then you have your fun little silver bullets that are occasionally going to win games for you, so stuff like Mimic Vat and White Sun Zenith are going to work really well. So that is my standard-legel EDH deck. This is something I've been doing for quite a while, and I've found it to be quite fun. It's especially enjoyable when you win games. You get to rub people's noses in it when their 60-card 4-of deck loses to this pile of crap. But generally the games are much, much more interesting than your traditional standard games. So this is one way I managed to bring fun back to standard.